Hi there, I'm Jessie Smith, and today I'll be presenting on our paper and tool, Real ML, Recognizing, Exploring, and Articulating Limitations of Machine Learning Research. This work was authored by myself alongside my co-authors, Saleema Amershi, Solon Barocas, Hanna Wallach, and Jennifer Wortman Vaughan. Let's begin at the beginning. What is a limitation in machine learning research? Though there aren't any agreed upon standard definitions of limitations in the machine learning research community, we define limitations in our paper as drawbacks in the design or execution of research that may impact the resulting findings and claims. Despite the apparent stigma surrounding disclosing limitations in research, in this work, we do not see limitations as a negative aspect of research. Rather, we see limitations as an inherent part of the research process. Decisions that are made during research will limit the claims that can be made in the research. And this isn't negative or positive, it's just a part of conducting research. Disclosing and discussing limitations in other scientific fields are often seen as necessary for improving scientific rigor and research integrity, because it can help with research reproducibility, credibility, and responsibility. But despite these benefits, the ML research community is known for not having well-developed norms around disclosing and discussing limitations. In the last 2 years, the Neural Information Processing Systems, or NeurIPS conference, has released broader impact statements and a subsequent paper checklist, which encourages authors to articulate limitations in their research. But despite these efforts, disclosure and discussion of limitations still remains uncommon in the ML research community. Since little to no research had been previously conducted on limitations in the discipline of machine learning research, we wanted to start our investigation by talking with machine learning researchers to explore how the community understands limitations and what challenges they face when disclosing limitations in their work. While exploring how ML researchers interact with limitations in their own work, we iteratively designed the Real ML tool, which is a set of guided activities with an accompanying worksheet that can be used to help ML researchers appropriately identify and address limitations in their research, with specific guidance for including limitations in their peer-reviewed publications. Specifically, we sought to answer 4 research questions. First, what is a limitation of ML research? What types of limitations are there? How do they arise? Second, what challenges do ML researchers face when seeking to recognize limitations? Third, what challenges do ML researchers face when exploring and articulating limitations? And finally, what practical support would help alleviate some of these challenges for ML researchers? To answer these questions, we conducted a 3-stage interview and survey study with 30 researchers from within and outside of the machine learning discipline to iteratively design Real ML. We began with an initial prototype of the tool that utilized input from various colleagues and our own research team's decades of combined experience in the machine learning research discipline. This prototype included a taxonomy of common decisions researchers make that lead to limitations, types of limitations that we had encountered in our research, and preliminary steps for writing a limitation, which was adapted from Ross and Zaidi's 4-step process for articulating limitations in medical studies. After coming up with these lists, we interviewed 20 machine learning researchers who had previously published their own ML research and asked them about their experiences with limitations in their own work. We asked participants how they defined the word limitation and what challenges they had faced when recognizing, exploring, or articulating those limitations in their peer-reviewed papers. We asked participants to share with us an ML research paper that they had previously published and used the current version of Real ML to try to help them articulate the limitations of their past work, all while gathering feedback on the tool. During our 6th iteration of the tool, we recruited 6 more research experts to participate in stage 2 of our study. In this stage of our study, we sought to surface any community norms or assumptions that might have been taken for granted by ML researchers, but that might stand out to researchers in ML adjacent fields, many of whom had subjected the field to more critical interrogation. During these interviews, we asked each participant to describe their impressions of community norms around limitations, and also asked them for feedback on Real ML, placing emphasis on helping ML researchers articulate limitations more effectively for different audiences, such as reviewers, researchers, and practitioners. After 6 iterations of Real ML, in order to evaluate if the tool was actually usable and useful for researchers without an interviewer present, we recruited 4 machine learning researchers who were in the process of writing ML papers for submission to a peer-reviewed conference or journal and asked each of them to use Real ML. Each participant filled out a survey telling us about their experience and providing feedback. After taking into account the final few edits suggested by the survey participants, we worked as a team on the final iteration of Real ML that is now published and available for machine learning researchers to use to help them appropriately disclose limitations in their own work. During the interviews we conducted, we uncovered several themes that helped us answer our research questions. First, we discovered that there was no single agreed upon definition of limitations in machine learning research. Some participants thought that limitations were an inherent part of research and weren't seen as bad or good, but rather neutral. Other participants thought that limitations were a sign of bad research, which contributed to their fear that if they were to disclose limitations in their research papers, that might potentially fuel a reviewer's decision to reject their paper. A lot of participants, including both junior and senior researchers, defined limitations by narrowing in on a single type of limitation, often drawing on examples they had encountered previously. The 2 most common types of limitations that participants used to define a limitation broadly was a lack of generalizability or a lack of robustness. When we worked with participants to explore the limitations of their previous work, we asked them to reflect on how their limitations might have arose in their research. The responses from this question led us to create 3 categories of sources of limitations: unavoidable constraints, unforeseen challenges, and implicit or explicit decisions made during the research process. One of the important themes that emerged here was that limitations might arise in a researcher's work, even if it isn't necessarily their fault. One example of this was brought up by participant 7, who expressed that lack of access to compute is a type of limitation that I have no control over. I can do my best, but I can only do whatever I can with the small amount of compute that I have, so this is a limitation that's out of my control. Throughout the interviews, we also tried to uncover the challenges that researchers had faced when recognizing limitations in their work in the past to better help us curate Real ML to guide researchers to identify the limitations of their work by alleviating the specific challenges that were commonly encountered. We uncovered that junior scholars had especially difficult times recognizing limitations in their work. They either failed to recognize them at all, or they recognized too many. For those who had failed to recognize limitations at all, they attributed this challenge to their lack of experience in the machine learning research discipline. Especially since it's uncommon to report limitations in ML research scholarship, they didn't have many examples to guide them outside of what their advisors told them to address. For those who recognized too many limitations, they attributed this to their lack of confidence in their own research as a junior scholar for various reasons, which we describe in more detail in the full paper. Interestingly enough, even though almost all of the senior researchers that we interviewed expressed that they didn't have difficulty recognizing limitations in their work, some of these senior research participants were still unable to come up with a definition of limitations beyond a lack of generalizability or a lack of robustness, which indicated that they too could benefit from additional guidance when recognizing limitations beyond these 2 types. To address our 3rd research question, we investigated what challenges participants had faced when exploring and articulating limitations in their previously published work. We discovered 2 main themes. First, many participants explained that it was challenging for them to articulate limitations in a way that was honest and all-encompassing, while also attempting to not, quote, shoot themselves in the foot, as participant 14 put it. Participant 2 expressed frustration around the, quote, double-edged sword of limitations, stating that, quote, not mentioning enough limitations is grounds for rejection, but mentioning too many limitations is also grounds for rejection. It appeared that a challenge experienced by participants of all experience levels was a fear that exposing too many limitations in their research papers might lead those papers to get rejected by reviewers. A few participants explained that it was difficult for them to know how much information to disclose about limitations in their papers, especially given that reviewer norms differ between ML research conferences and between individual reviewers. In addition to this fear of rejection, many participants also shared that they had struggled to know how to frame limitations in their papers. Should they make a limitations section, or should they introduce limitations throughout their paper? What if they were already struggling to get all of their research into the incredibly small page limits required for their submission? And how could they describe limitations in a narrative that was honest and thorough without making readers lose trust in the value of their work? All of these challenges brought up by participants heavily influenced our design of Real ML. On the screen, you can see an outline of Real ML. The first three sections of this tool include reviewing common sources and types of limitations, recognizing limitations in your research, and exploring important aspects of your limitations, which are all tracked by filling in the accompanying Real ML worksheet. And the final section includes guidance on how to articulate important limitations to your readers. The recognizing section of Real ML helps researchers brainstorm which limitations might have arose in their research. Before completing this activity, we introduce researchers to the three sources of limitations that were identified by participants: unavoidable constraints, unforeseen challenges, and implicit or explicit decisions. The first activity in Real ML encourages researchers to reflect on each of these categories to brainstorm the various sources of potential limitations in their own work, recognizing that sometimes limitations might arise even if it isn't the researcher's fault. We also introduce researchers to a list of common types of limitation in ML research to help them spark their thoughts about the limitations of their own work, which you can see a condensed version of on this slide. This list of the common types of limitations in ML research was also one of our important contributions in this work, since no similar list had previously been generated in the ML research community to help guide researchers to recognize which limitations they encountered in their own work. We describe these limitation types in more detail in the full paper. All of the activities in the recognizing section of Real ML guide the researcher to list out all the possible limitations they might have encountered in their work by filling out the first half of the Real ML worksheet. In the exploring section of Real ML, we ask researchers to go through each limitation they identified so far in the worksheet and answer a series of questions that prompts them to think about what information different stakeholders of their research might need to know about that limitation. In the final articulating section, we help guide researchers through writing their own limitation section in their paper by carefully selecting the most important information they uncovered about each limitation while completing the previous activities in Real ML. This includes a tips and tricks section of the tool that provides guidance on some of the difficulties that participants brought up during interviews, such as how to prioritize which information to include if they are running into page limits. Of course, we would be remiss to create Real ML without sharing the limitations of our own work. First, this work was conducted through an interpretivist framework, which reflects our own team's biases and subjectivities. In addition to this, because we recruited through social media, selection bias was unavoidable, and the participants that we interviewed might have been more inclined to use the tool like Real ML in their own work, which means that the results of our interviews might not reflect the entire ML research community as a whole. We also recognize that even though we recruited participants from a diverse range of backgrounds and experience levels, because we largely recruited through our personal networks, we ended up with an imbalanced sample of research backgrounds. For example, many interview participants had expertise in natural language processing, but only one participant had expertise in learning theory. All of this is also a really good segue for us to express that even though we designed Real ML to help machine learning researchers of all backgrounds, we understand that people who use this tool may have different needs when it comes to articulating the limitations of their research. And we recommend that researchers adapt the tool or worksheet to fit their individual needs. Finally, although we were able to complete a preliminary survey evaluating Real ML in practice, we haven't yet conducted a full evaluation of the final version with ML researchers beyond the 4 survey participants, so additional research will be needed to measure the effectiveness of Real ML in practice. In summary, this work was a really great opportunity for us to explore the current state of limitations in the machine learning research community, to understand what challenges researchers currently face, and what stigmas people might have for or against disclosing limitations in their work. During our interviews, we did uncover a few opportunities for growth in the ML research community that could help alleviate some of these challenges that researchers face when disclosing and discussing limitations in their work. Most notably, the emphasis on generalizability in the review process appears to encourage inappropriate disclosure about the real limits on the claims of ML research results. Additionally, many participants expressed concerns about whether disclosing limitations would increase the likelihood of paper rejection, in part because the ML publication venue reviewing norms, and in part because of perceived differences in reviewers' opinions about disclosing limitations. These kinds of challenges would require huge shifts in the ML research community to address. And though real ML is a great start, combating these challenges is beyond the scope of what can be accomplished with a tool. As always, though we outlined some of the key information from the research in this talk, there is much more detail included in the full paper, which we encourage you to read. You can also find Real ML at the link on the screen, and we encourage you to try it out yourself on your next machine learning research project. Thanks for listening.